The English Benedictine Reform, a monastic reform of the English Church in the late 10th century, was the most important religious and intellectual movement in the later Anglo-Saxon period. In the mid-10th century, almost all monasteries were staffed by secular clergy, who were often married. The reformers sought to replace them with celibate contemplative monks following the Rule of Saint Benedict. The movement was inspired by European monastic reforms, and the leading figures were Dunstan, Archbishop of Canterbury; Æthelwold, Bishop of Winchester; and Oswald, Archbishop of York. In 7th and 8th century England, most monasteries were Benedictine, but in the 9th century learning and monasticism declined severely. Alfred the Great deplored the decline and started to reverse it. The court of Æthelstan, the first king of the whole of England, was cosmopolitan, and future reformers such as Dunstan and Æthelwold learned from continental exponents of Benedictine monasticism. The English movement became dominant under King Edgar, who supported the expulsion of secular clergy from monasteries and cathedral chapters, and the replacement by monks. The reformers had close relations with the Crown, furthering its interests and depending on its support. The movement was confined to the South and Midlands, as the Crown was not strong enough in the North to confiscate property from a local elites to establish Benedictine foundations in the area. The movement declined after the deaths of its leading exponents at the end of the 10th century. The artistic workshops established by Æthelwold reached a high standard of craftsmanship in manuscript illustration, sculpture and gold and silver, and were influential both in England and on the continent. In his monasteries, learning reached a high standard, producing competent prose and poetry in the elaborate hermeneutic style of Latin favoured in 10th century England. His Winchester school played an important role in creating the standard vernacular West Saxon literary language, and his pupil Alfric was its most eminent writer. All surviving medieval accounts of the movement are by supporters of reform, who strongly condemned what they saw as the corruption and religious inadequacy of the secular clergy. But historians in the late 20th and early 21st centuries have increasingly seen these accounts as unfairly biased against the secular clergy. Background: the author of the Rule of Saint Benedict, which was the principal monastic code in Europe in the early Middle Ages, was Saint Benedict of Nursia. Under this rule, the lives of the monks were mainly devoted to prayer, together with reading sacred texts and manual work. They lived a communal life and were required to give complete obedience to their abbot. Benedict's achievement was to produce a stable system characterized by moderation and prudence. The 7th century saw the development of a powerful monastic movement in England, which was strongly influenced by the ideas of Saint Benedict, and the late 7th century scholar English Aldhelm assumed that monasteries would normally follow the Benedictine rule. However, by 800, few foundations could claim high spiritual and intellectual standards, and the 9th century saw a sharp decline in learning and monasticism. Political and financial pressures, partly due to disruption caused by Viking attacks, led to an increasing preference for pastoral clergy over contemplative monks. There was a progressive transfer of property from the minsters to the crown, which accelerated after 850. According to John Blair, to a significant extent, the royal administration had achieved territorial stability by battening onto minsters. Well might late 10th century polemicists blame kings of Wessex and the magnates, even more than the Vikings, for despoiling the church's resources. The scars of the Viking raids had healed, but the secularization of minsters continued on its slow, consistent course. At the end of of the 9th century, Alfred the Great started to revive learning and monasticism, and this work was carried on by his grandson, King Æthelstan. Kings before Edgar did not take the view, which was adopted by Æthelwold and his circle, that the only worthwhile religious life was Benedictine monasticism. When Gerard of Brunn reformed the Abbey of St. Bertin in St. Omer in 944, dissident monks found a refuge in England under King Edmund. Before the 10th century reform, the lines between secular clergy and monastics were sometimes blurred. There are cases of communities of monks established to provide pastoral care, and clergy in some secular establishments lived according to monastic rules. Early development. The Benedictine Reform movement on the continent started with the foundation of Cluny Abbey in Burgundy in 909–10, but the influence of Cluny, which was innovative in its customs, was largely confined to Burgundy. England's closest links were with the more conservative Fleury Abbey on the Loire, which had great prestige because it held St. Benedict's body. The leaders of the English movement were also influenced by the reforms which had been promulgated by the Carolingian Holy Roman Emperor Louis the Pious at the Synods of Aachen in the aged tens, and particularly the promulgation of uniform monastic rules under the authority of the Crown. Modest religious and diplomatic contacts between England and the continent under Alfred and his son Edward the Elder intensified during the reign of Æthelstan, which saw the start of the monastic revival. 4 of Æthelstan's half-sisters married European rulers, resulting in closer contacts between the English and continental courts than ever before. Many manuscripts were imported, influencing English art and scholarship and art, and English churchmen learned about the continental Benedictine Reform movement. The leaders of the English Benedictine Reform were Dunstan, Archbishop of Canterbury, Æthelwold, Bishop of Winchester, and Oswald, Archbishop of York. Dunstan and Æthelwold reached maturity in Æthelstan's cosmopolitan intellectual court in the 930s, where they met monks from the European Reformed houses which provided the inspiration for the English movement. In the early 940s Dunstan was appointed Abbot of Glastonbury, where he was joined by Æthelwold, and they spent much of the next decades studying Benedictine texts at Glastonbury, which became the first centre for disseminating monastic reform. The Rule of Saint Benedict was translated into Old English at this time, probably by Æthelwold, and it is the only surviving prose translation of the rule into a European vernacular in the early Middle Ages. In about 954 Æthelwold wished to go to the continent to study reforms there at first hand, but King Edgar refused him permission and appointed him Abbot of Abingdon, which became the second centre. Dunstan was exiled by King Edward between 956 and 958, and he spent this time observing Benedictine practices at St. Peter's Abbey in Ghent. Æthelwold, on the other hand, appears to have been on good terms with Edward, an early indication that the reformers were not united politically. Oswald was a nephew of Edgar, Archbishop of Canterbury from 941 to 958. Edgar, who was a supporter of reform, introduced Oswald to Fleury, where he was ordained and spent a large part of the 950s. The Reform and the Crown. Rosamund McKittrick observes that the zeal for monastic reform undoubtedly was a common bond right across Europe. On the other hand, relations between monasteries and the patrons vary. Where rulers were weak, as in Burgundy, Cluny looked to the papacy for protection, whereas in other areas such as Flanders, monasteries had close links with local rulers. In England there was a close dependence on the royal family and very little papal influence. The accession of Edgar, the first king to strongly support reform, in 959, led to court support for the imposition of Benedictine rules on a number of old minsters, with monks imported from houses such as Oswald's Westbury, Antrim, Dunstan's Glastonbury and Æthelwold's Abingdon. Hardly any of the reformed houses were new foundations, but a few nunneries, which had royal connections, were established in Wiltshire and Hampshire. In 963 Edgar appointed Æthelwold as Bishop of Winchester, and with the support of the king and the pope, the new bishop promptly expelled the secular clergy from the city's old and new minsters, and replaced them with monks. The secular clerks and the supporters were local people of consequence, and the king had to resort to force to confiscate the wealthy beneficers. By 975 around 30 male houses and 7 or 8 nunneries had been reformed, all in Wessex, places in the Midlands where Æthelwold and Oswald held property. But the reformed houses were then probably only around 10% of the religious establishments. The wealthiest reformed monasteries were far richer than ordinary secular minsters, and the late 11th century Domesday Book shows that some possessed almost as much land as the greatest lay magnates. But rich and important unreformed houses such as Chester Street and Bury St Edmunds flourished into the 11th century. The Reformers' propaganda, mainly from Æthelwold's circle, claimed that the Church was transformed in Edgar's reign. But in Blair's view, to the religious culture, when we probe beneath the surface, starts to look less exclusive and more like that of Æthelstan's and Edmund's. Edgar was concerned about different interpretations of the Benedictine rule in different monasteries in his kingdom, and wanted to impose uniform rules to be followed by all. The rules were set out in the key document of the English Reform, the Regularis Concordia, which was adopted by the Council of Winchester in around 970. The Concordia was written by Æthelwold, who had sought advice from Ghent and Fleury abbeys. A major aim of the Concordia was the regularization of the form of church services, and Æthelwold tried to synthesize what he regarded as the best continental and English practice. On the continent there were different interpretations of the Benedictine rule, but in England uniform practice was a matter of political principle. The Concordia said that King Edgar urged all to be of one mind as regards monastic usage, and so, with the minds anchored firmly on the ordinances of the rule, to avoid all dissension, lest differing ways of observing the customs of one rule and one country should bring the holy conversation into disrepute. Fleury's customs were the most important influence on the Regularis Concordia, and Fleury itself appears to have been influenced by English liturgical practices. The conquest of the Danelaw by West Saxon kings had united England in a single kingdom for the first time, enabling kings from Æthelstan onwards to see themselves as heirs of the Carolingian emperors. The regulation of monasteries by uniform Benedictine rule was designed to unite the kingdom ideologically and enhance royal prestige. The monks depended on the king in a way that the local ealdormen did not, so the loyalty could be trusted and they could act as a counterbalance to powerful local families. The Regularis Concordia required that psalms be said for the king and the queen in monasteries several times a day, and specified that royal consent must be obtained for the election of abbots. The reformers aimed to enhance the Christian character of kingship, and one aspect of this was to raise the status of the queen. Edgar's last wife, Æthelwold, was the first king's consort to regularly witness charters as Regina. The reformers' propaganda claimed that England had been unified as a result of the wide acceptance of Benedictinism, and that the movement's greatest benefactor, King Edgar, had played a major role in the unification by his demands for adherence to the Benedictine rule. Æthelwold probably tutored Edgar as a boy, and was very close to him. It is likely that Æthelwold was influential in persuading the king to carry through his reforms and support Benedictine monasticism. Monks became dominant on the bishop's bench during his reign. Æthelwold was close to Queen Æthelthryth, and supported the claim of her son Æthel to be king against his elder half-brother Edward. Dunstan supported Edward, who succeeded on Edgar's death in 975. Æthel became king on his half-brother's murder in 978, and Æthelwold was then a powerful figure at court until his death in 984. The nobility and the Reform. Nobles made donations to Reformed foundations for religious reasons, and many believed that they could save their souls by patronizing holy men who would pray for them, and thus help to expiate the sins. In some cases, gifts were a payment for the right to be buried at a monastery. Some aristocrats founded new monasteries. For example, Æthelwold, Ealdorman of East Anglia, founded Ramsey Abbey in 969, gave it many gifts, and translated the relics of two martyred princes to it. Gifts were designed to increase the prestige of both the donor and recipient, as when Ealdorman Byrhtnoth of Essex, later to be the hero of the Battle of Malden, gave Ely Abbey 30 mancasses of gold, 20 pounds of silver, 2 gold crosses, 2 lace palls containing precious works of gold and gems, and 2 finely made gloves. Upon his death, his widow added a large hanging worked with images of his victories, apparently previously hanging at the house, and a gold torque. The 12th century local chronicle, the Librariensis, records 14 churches which also received gifts from him. Noble's choice of recipient was determined by the relationship with individual monks and other aristocrats. An individual would patronize the same foundations that other family members and allies supported, but despoil the property of houses associated with his political adversaries. Æthelwold of East Anglia and Æthelfhere, Ealdorman of Mercia, were the leaders of the two rival factions. Æthelfhere seized land of Æthelwin's Ramsey and was an enemy of Archbishop Oswald and an ally of Bishop Æthelwold. Æthelwold, a friend of Oswald, sometimes seized land belonging to Æthelwold's Ely. Oswald himself used his position to assist his relatives, leasing Worcester lands to them in ways which had been forbidden by 9th-century synods. The historian Janet Pope comments, "It appears that religion, even monasticism, could not break the tight kin group as the basic social structure in 10th-century England. The three leaders of the movement were all aristocrats, and they were able to get the support of the family and friends as well as the king." In Pope's view, this close link between the monks and the nobles is ultimately the most important factor in the success of the reform. Wormold agrees, stating that aristocratic support for monastic reform was more important for its success than royal or papal sponsorship. The aristocracy did not confine the support to reformed foundations, but continued to donate to unreformed ones. Monks and clerics. Nicholas Brooks describes Dunstan as the ablest and best-loved figure that 10th-century England produced, and observes that his example helped to inspire a massive transfer of landed resources from the secular aristocracy to the religious aristocracy. It made possible a revival of scholarly, religious, pastoral and cultural standards in late 10th-century England that gave a distinctively monastic character to the English church and hierarchy. But Brooks admits that it is very difficult to point to any specific contribution that he made to the reform, and Robertson questions Dunstan's importance. At the present time it would be unwise to give a definitive answer to the question whether Dunstan's role as the instigator of a monastic monastic reform movement was a 10th century fact or a 12th century fiction. Æthelwold reformed monasteries in his own diocese of Winchester, and he also helped to restore houses in eastern England such as Peterborough, Ely, Thorney and St Neots. Almost all had been monasteries in the 7th century, and had later become communities of secular clerks or transferred to secular ownership, so he could argue that he was just restoring their original status. He also restored nunneries, working with his ally, Queen Æthelwold. He did not merely attempt to revive the historical church, but also to improve it by inventing dubious pedigrees for his houses. He was the main propagandist for the movement, and wrote all the major works supporting it in England during Edgar's reign. Blair describes the basic aim of the movement, both in England and on the continent, as being to establish and disseminate high liturgical, spiritual and pastoral standards. On the continent, cathedral chapters were staffed by secular canons, and only monasteries had monks. Æthelwold rejected this distinction. His expulsion of clerics in favour of monks from Winchester Cathedral as well as the new minster introduced a unique feature to the English Reform. Dunstan and Oswald hesitated to follow his example, probably because unlike Æthelwold they had lived abroad and understood continental practice, and also because they preferred a gradualist approach to Æthelwold's confrontational strategy. Oswald installed monks at Worcester Cathedral, but he built a new church for them and retained the clerics, who were educated with the monks in the same classroom. Canterbury did not become fully monastic until after Dunstan's death. Æthelwold was a historian who was reviving what he believed to be the practice of the past, particularly Pope Gregory the Great's injunction to Augustine in the Libelis Responsonum, as reported by B. that Augustine should continue as a bishop to live the life of a monk. Blair argues that large religious institutions could not function without priests carrying out parochial duties, and he comments that Æthelwold's rejection of all forms of religious life but the monastic was decidedly odd. The lurid stigmatizations of clerics as foul, lazy, and lascivious come mainly from his circle. Quote, "Although the rule of Saint Benedict barred monks from engaging in external ministry, English Benedictines were actively engaged in pastoral work and teaching the secular clergy." Dunstan's first biographer, called B., was a secular cleric who left Glastonbury for Legion around 960. After 980 he made several attempts to gain the patronage of leading English churchmen, but they were unsuccessful because monastic reformers were unwilling to assist a secular canon living abroad. The secular priests lacked able scholars to defend themselves, and no defense against Æthelwold's charges has survived. The leading 12th century historians, John of Worcester and William of Malmesbury, were Benedictines who reinforced the secular's negative image. The diverse minsters and religious practices of Anglo-Saxon England were disguised by a small group which obtained a near monopoly of the religious record and presented an unreal picture of religious uniformity. Saints and relics. Reformers attached great importance to the elevation and translation of saints, moving the bodies from their initial resting place to a higher and more prominent location to make them more accessible for veneration. An important precursor was the 7th century translation of the remains of St. Benedict himself from Monte Cassino to Fleury Abbey. By the 10th century, translation usually involved a grand procession, an elaborate new shrine, and often reconstruction of the church. Almost nothing is known of the life of Swithin, who was an obscure 9th century bishop of Winchester until Æthelwold launched a major cult of him as a saint, and translated his grave from outside the old minster to a new shrine inside. After Æthelwold's own death in 984, his progress to becoming the subject of a cult followed the conventional path. His grave is said to have been neglected until he appeared in a vision to St. say that his body should be moved, and his successor Æthelwold then built a new choir to hold his body, where it became the focus of miracles. Saints were believed to have an active power after death, and the reformers made great efforts to transfer saints' remains and relics from obscure minsters to their own new establishments. Characteristically, Æthelwold showed great energy in this. Gifts of land and other possessions to a church were often expressed as donations to its principal saint, so the seizure of such a saint's remains from an unreformed community could then justify the transfer of its wealth to a Benedictine monastery, on the ground that as property had been donated to the saint, it should follow his or her body to its new home. The reformers had what Alan Thacker calls a mania for saint-making and relic collecting. Theft of relics from unreformed communities to increase a church's collection was common, such as Ely Abbey's relic raid on Durham in 974 to obtain the remains of St. Witburg. This was probably associated with the acquisition by Ely of Durham Church, and may have been a means of ensuring that the abbey kept possession of the church's estates. According to Thacker, Æthelwold's activities were on an unrivaled scale. Not all, one suspects, were yielded willingly to Æthelwold's grasping representatives. Æthelwold obviously wanted his monasteries to be centers of spiritual power, an aim he sought to fulfill by making them the home of as many saints as possible. Undoubtedly, too, he was anxious to remove relics from the guardianship of secular communities to a reformed monastic environment. But ultimately, even more vital was the link between cult and territorial possession, focused on the saint's role as protector and spiritual lord of his community. On the other hand, although Oswald was active in promoting cults, he does not generally seem to have used relic collecting as a means of gaining control of the assets of secular communities, and Dunstan displayed no interest in relics.